Farmers today are facing rising costs, volatile markets, and extreme weather. The A Better Way to Farm podcast digs into strategies to help you take control of farm inputs and maximize profit so your farm can thrive for generations. Remember to take advantage of our free resources at abetterwaytofarm.com. Now, from America's Heartland, here's your host.
We're on day 7, and we're excited to come in here and talk about sulfur. What are some things it can bring us? What are some problems if we don't have it? How do we get it? And why are we not getting it for free like we used to? Those are all things that are relative to us. Starting with our roles of the essential nutrients sheet, as we talk about sulfur here, and I'm going to say this many times because amino acids are really big right now, and this is an integral part of amino acids. This helps develop enzymes and vitamins. It promotes nodule formation on legumes. It aids in seed production, and it's necessary for chlorophyll formation. It is not one of the constituents of chlorophyll, but it is necessary for chlorophyll formation. We know that in nature it tends to exist in a ratio of 100 parts carbon to 10 parts nitrogen to 1 part sulfur. Part of the problem in working through things in nature is that balance tends to take care of itself first. And I'm going to come back to this again, but know this. Your plants eat at the second table. You don't just set a plate down and the plants get to start eating off of that plate. What happens is we put the nutrients out there and then the chemistry of the soil takes over. So if we're really short on this carbon to nitrogen to sulfur ratio and we're way short on sulfur, some of that's going to get tied up and not be available in order to get to your plants. If we have a lot of, say, magnesium out there, and the first thing that happens is you get a chemical reaction and that sulfur becomes magnesium sulfate, and now all of a sudden you don't have sulfur available for your plants. So there's a lot of things to bear in mind here as we look at this, a lot of chemistry type things that can really hurt us in regards to getting enough sulfur into the plant. As we start looking at how the different products interact, we do know that sulfur is one of those nutrients, being negatively charged, it is prone to tie up with a lot of other things. Starting out in the Midwest Laboratories Agronomy Handbook, they say that sulfur is rapidly becoming the 4th major plant food nutrient for crop production. In other words, they're thinking you ought to move this from a secondary to a primary, and that makes total sense. As we're going to see later, a corn plant needs as much sulfur as it does phosphorus. And so we've got to make sure here that we're making this thing work in the right ways. Sulfur rivals nitrogen in protein synthesis and phosphorus in uptake by the crops. The largest portion of your total sulfur in the soil is contained in soil organic matter. Sulfate sulfur becomes available to the plant through a bacterial oxidation of the organic matter. Elemental sulfur, atmospheric sulfur compounds, and other reduced forms of sulfur. Plants absorb sulfur in the sulfate, or SO4, with a double negative charge ion, which is generally not retained in the soil to any great extent, as the sulfates, being soluble, tend to move with the soil water and are readily leached from the soil under conditions of high rainfall and or irrigation. And this is especially true in regards to low capacity or low CEC, like sandy soils. Again, that ratio of nitrogen to sulfur in the plant tissue is a good, reliable indicator of sulfur requirement. Sulfur deficiencies could show up in a buildup of non-protein nitrogen compounds or as nitrates in the plant tissue. This deficiency reduces activity of the enzyme nitrate reductase in plants. On the average, the grass crops require a ratio of 1 part sulfur to every 14 parts of nitrogen, where a legume crop require approximately a ratio of 1 part sulfur to every 10 parts nitrogen. And for those of you who are playing around in the canola world, a lot of times it would seem to us the work that we're looking at would say that sulfur needs to be available at a ratio of 1 to 6 for part of that canola plant's life. And for the majority of that canola plant's life, it needs to be 1 to 4. In other words, for every 4 parts nitrogen, you need 1 part sulfur, which means what? We've probably been overusing nitrogen and under-applying sulfur. What are the functions of it? As a plant nutrient, to increase the efficiency of nitrogen being used by the plants. It increases protein in grasses and in grain. It increases yields. It controls the nitrate buildup in forage crops. It can help lower the pH of alkaline soils, thus increase the availability of your other plant nutrients. It can control sodium and calcium and salt buildup in problem soils. It is one of the constituents that needs to be used to try and reclaim those alkaline soils. and it just generally improves the physical condition of your soils. Guys, this is an overlooked nutrient, and in one of the books here later, it's going to talk about this, but know this, we've known for a long time. 30 years ago, we started saying we need more sulfur, and everybody was still stuck in the old days, in the good old days, the way Grandpa used to do it, and we used to get a lot of sulfur and a lot of boron out of acid rain. And we have cleaned up the environment, and we no longer get free boron, we no longer get free sulfur. Now we have to purchase those and put them on. And it's going to be very important as we move forward. This is only going to get more and more and more. Coming out of the Fertilizer Institute, or the Fertilizer Institute with their fertility handbook. And they talk about, again, the fact that the main form of sulfur in the soil is inorganic sulfates and sulfur in organic matter, because plants absorb sulfur as the sulfate ion only. Organic sulfur must be mineralized to the sulfate form to become available. In this book, which is older, and we would love to get it reprinted, but it says, atmospheric sulfur dioxide has been a major source of sulfur for crops. Annual amounts ranging up to 25 pounds of sulfur per acre may be deposited through precipitation on the land, with heavier amounts near industrial centers where emissions of sulfur oxides are high from fuel burning installations. As atmospheric emissions of sulfur dioxide are reduced by environmental controls, sulfur needs in crops must be supplied by fertilizer sources. Guys, that means we're out looking. What are the sources we like? We love ammonium sulfate, the dry product, 210024. Great product, especially to spread 100 pounds or so on those higher pH soils. We like potassium sulfate. If you're needing K, what a great way to get it with the potassium sulfate, 5000-17. We get some 50% K, 17% sulfate, and that is a good thing too. We like potassium thiosulfate, a 120026 liquid. We like ammonium thiosulfate, the 120026. Potassium thiosulfate, 002517, 25% K, 17% sulfur. Ammonium thiosulfate, 120026. That can be co-applied with your 28 or your 32, and we like that a lot. We encourage our people, unless they've got really high sulfur levels, to be using that product every time they go out there. When we tell our guys, we tell them, if you're going to put on nitrogen, we just assume you're going to put on sulfur with that, because that's the right way to do this and to make things happen. When we look here in the Western Handbook, they say here's the symptoms to look for. Number one, your newer tissue, in other words, the leaves at the top, will be yellowish. Your stems can be smaller in diameter, and they are hard and they are woody. Why would that be? Oh yeah, because without enough sulfur, what do we have happening? The nitrate's building up in the plant. When nitrate builds up in the plant, we get that real woody stalk, and nutrients don't move and moisture don't move. Although your roots may be well developed and extensive, they are also smaller in diameter. Lots of reasons to be faithful to the use of sulfur and be judicious, not just go put it on. I think it was a year and a half ago. I was reading one of the farm magazines, and they had discovered, somebody in there was talking about the fact that they had discovered that sulfur was making a difference. And so what was their recommendation? Everybody should just go put on 30 pounds. Guys, one size never fits all. And the idea of just going and putting on 30 pounds is not a good idea. What are we going to do? We're going to soil test, and we're going to put on what it says, no more and no less. General recommendations at best will get you general results. Please remember that. And we're not looking for general results. We're looking for fantastic results. And we're looking for ROI. And we cannot, as we go into 2026, afford to be throwing darts at a board with a blindfold on, hoping that we hit the triple 20 or the bullseye. We need to be making sure that we're aiming at exactly what we want, and that we are getting everything out of those dollars that we're spending just as accurately as we possibly can. From Schrieffer and the Soil Up, he says that sulfur is essential for the conversion of nitrogen into amino acids and the linkage of these amino acids into complete proteins. When sulfur is low, the nitrates accumulate in the plant tissue instead of forming amino acids and protein. Guys, yes, nitrogen makes protein, but we see a lot of guys having trouble with their crops falling over because they're laying the nitrogen to it, hoping to get better protein, especially in wheat. We got to get the protein up. but let's address the sulfur need. The good news is wheat has a smaller sulfur need than the other crops. We'll get into that here just in a little bit. But the fact of the matter is it needs that sulfur. And in the absence of the sulfur, the nitrates accumulate, they don't form amino acids, and they don't form protein. We're seeing a ton of products out here on the market right now where we're selling amino acids. And I'm not saying that that's a bad idea. But what I am saying is before I buy bugs in a jug, before I buy mycorrhiza, before I buy amino acids, I want to do everything I can that's foundational to produce all of that as naturally as possible. Why do I want to buy something that I can make for free? And when I make it for free because I put on the right nutrients and I get a yield increase, that's kind of an added bonus. There's a lot of reasons, guys, to use this sulfur product, and knowing that it has a lot to do with the forming of those amino acids and those amino acids turning into protein looks like a pretty good reason, a very compelling reason to me to be using the right amount of sulfur. Sulfur is not only necessary for the conversion of nitrogen into amino acids, but it is also a constituent of two sulfur-bearing amino acids, cysteine and methionine. It's methionine, and according to the dictionary, it's methionine is how it's pronounced correctly. These two sulfur-bearing amino acids are essential to all animal life, and their presence determines the biological value of a protein. An animal cannot live very long without these two sulfur-bearing amino acids. Alfalfa contains these two amino acids. When alfalfa is grown on a sulfur-deficient soil, it will become deficient in these acids, and the result will be the lowering of the biological value of its protein. Lower valued protein. Isn't that interesting? Many plants produce proteins that contain neither of the two essential sulfur-bearing amino acids, and these plants have a low biological protein value and must be supplemented if they're fed to animals. Sulfur is necessary for the formation of chlorophyll and the rate of photosynthesis. Plants with enough sulfur will have an exceptionally dark green coloration that can almost be called a sulfur trademark. Sulfur is also part of the defense mechanism of plants. Low sulfur will invite the invasions of insects and disease in crops. Guys, here we go again. We know that having the healthiest crop helps us ward off pests, whether it be insects or disease. We know potassium, big on plant health. Copper, big on plant health. Sulfur, big on plant health. Why do we not want to make that plant just as healthy as we can and take advantage of everything that using sulfur gives us? I'm not here. You know I'm not a one nutrient person. I don't think that I see so many people today writing articles, doing podcasts, getting on social media and saying, this thing right here, this one thing, this is all you need to do. Guys, y'all got a pickup truck more than likely. So if I come to you and I said, listen, the only thing you need to do is put gas in that truck. That's it. Don't worry about it. Don't check the oil. Don't check the water. Don't check the transmission fluid. Don't worry about the oil in the front end or the rear end. Don't worry about none of that. Just put gas in her. It'll run for a while. It'll even work really good for a while. And then what happens? All of a sudden gas is important, but so is engine oil. And somewhere down the road, when that engine oil gets enough miles on it, or it burns enough oil, or it gets low on oil, or like someone who bought a Suburban from me, hit a 2x4 on the interstate, knocked a hole in the oil filter, and ran the engine clear out of oil, all of a sudden, gasoline wasn't enough, okay? Takes engine oil, takes transmission fluid, takes all of the different things. It takes brake fluid. You think gasoline's really important? Run out of brake fluid and see what happens. Guys, this is really important that we do everything correctly, and sulfur is one of the many nutrients that are really needed and very, very critical in that life of a plant. Working out of Neil's book, Hands-on Agronomy, he says if we put sulfur on a high mag soil, it will reduce the magnesium, provided there is already sufficient calcium present. Pay attention here. This is why we like gypsum on those high mag soils. We put down more calcium. We need the calcium to take the place of the magnesium on the soil colloid, right? We need the calcium to replace the magnesium because the magnesium raises pH, assuming that we had a low pH. And so we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing here and putting that on. As I said earlier, what does this mean? This means when I apply sulfur to my corn over here across the road behind me, that I have really high mag soils. So therefore, I don't like put sulfur on and the sulfur all goes to the corn plant. That's not how that happens. I put sulfur on and some of that gets tied up in the form of magnesium sulfate, which is a good thing because I need rid of that magnesium. However, it's a bad thing because I don't have available sulfur for my plant. So it's very critical that I soil test and put on the right amount of sulfur to take advantage of it and to make sure I'm meeting those needs. Universities are actually on record in several states as saying that farmers don't need that much sulfur for corn. Our work shows that sulfur is one of the most underrated nutrients in farming. He knew this 30 years ago and it's still that way. Although in the last 2 years, we have seen the industry come around and start talking more and more and more about the importance of sulfur. And guys, I'm not a big fan of yellow elemental sulfur. Oh, it's fun to put on. I broadcast it and I go out there. I see those little yellow granules everywhere and I feel so good because I know the sulfur's out there. And then if I no-till, I go back next spring and I can still feel good because I still have little yellow granules out there. Isn't that interesting? If the little yellow granules are still there, I don't have sulfate going into my plant. Remember, the plants only take up the sulfate form. Use of ammonium sulfate when the calcium saturation is above 60% means taking out magnesium at the same time and better control of excess magnesium. But we need to get that base saturation rate on that calcium up to 60. All the nutrients work together. NO3, nitrate, is an anion with a negative charge. Chlorine has a negative charge. Sulfate has a double negative charge. Chloride leaves the soil easily. Nitrate also makes an easy exit. Sulfate will stick around a little bit longer, and that's good because we want it to stay put. But understand, it's only sticking around a little bit longer. It's still going to leave on you, and you want to make sure you have plenty. I'm going to share a story in here because I think that sometimes we get all hung up in facts and figures and chemistry equations, and we lose sight of what the real story is. I just want to share it with you. When I first started to work as a consultant in 1973, so we're talking 52 years ago, my mentor, Dr. William A. Albrecht, taught about the importance of sulfur. As a consequence, from the beginning of our work with soil fertility, sulfur was always tested right along with phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. It was always considered by Albrecht and had been for years, the point being that long before I ever got started, there was already a good track record on sulfur testing. There may be some labs that aren't sure about the accuracy of sulfur tests they can run. Get a new lab. There's still some of those. There are labs out here and there are agronomists out here say there's no reason to test for secondaries and there's no reason to test for micros because the results are not there. That's because we're using the wrong extraction methods in the wrong labs and probably the wrong agronomists. Moving on. But even in 73, we could be sure because of instruction by the few who knew from experience. Pay attention to this line. Perhaps if the authorities on fertility spent more time in the field working with sulfur instead of quoting other authorities, production would not be so hindered by dissemination of improper information about this extremely important, much needed nutrient. Guys, this is going on in ag everywhere. This guy's sitting around quoting this guy who's quoting this guy, and he's quoting the first guy. It's all a big circle, and they're doing the everybody knows. And ain't none of them got dirt under their fingernails or dirt on their boots. And it's important to get out into the field and see what these products do. That's why in the first 25 years of our career, when we ran about 1,000 test plots, literally that we planted ourselves, and we saw side-by-side comparisons, and we knew what the addition of different products did, what happens when we add the zinc or the manganese or the potassium sulfate. We saw the results. And guys, people who just sit around and drink overpriced wine and pontificate about how intelligent they are, but have no experience out in the field are very dangerous. Find somebody who's willing to get dirty. Find someone who knows what it means to sweat. Find someone who's walked a few hundred miles in cornfields and has some experience to draw upon. He goes on to say, the fact is sulfate, again, not sulfur, sulfate, is needed for growing plants just as badly and in much the same amounts as phosphorus. Sulfur, phosphorus, equal amounts. What have we been putting on? Lots of phosphorus, no sulfur. Yet farmers put on far more phosphate than sulfate. Furthermore, phosphate is more stable than sulfate in the soil. when the two compete for absorption, sulfate is the loser, especially when phosphate levels are very high. Consequently, soils either high in phosphorus or on the receiving end of high rates of phosphate fertilizer will need more sulfur to produce as they should. Otherwise, growers won't get their money's worth for all the phosphate that they put on. Guys, we know we got things that compete with each other to go into the plant. Too much iron, that's going to stop manganese from getting in that plant, right? We know that. We know if we have too much potassium, that's going to stop magnesium from going in that plant. We know if we have too much magnesium, that's going to stop the potassium from going into that plant. That ratio is a real killer if you don't have it right. We also know, and this is the first time I've caught this in all the years that I've done this, but sulfur and phosphorus compete. And too much phosphorus makes sulfur the loser. And how much phosphorus have we been putting on? How much phosphorus have you been putting on? And how much sulfur have you been putting on? Knowing that phosphorus does stick around, and you can actually get about 1% per year after the very first year of your applied phosphorus. But the sulfur is probably going to run away, and you're going to have to replace it. And it's really important to pay attention to this. If we're just laying a lot of NPK out there to it, if we're just laying that to her, guys, we know we're really doing a disservice from the sulfur standpoint. Some people say that 90% of the phosphate can be used by the time the corn completes tasseling, and 10% afterwards. So we have an earlier need on the phosphorus. With sulfur, 10% can be used before the corn tassels and 90% afterwards. That makes total sense. Why is that? Because it's going to make amino acids, which make protein. It has to do with the grain. It has to do with the fruit. It has to do with all of those things. It's going to help with test weight. It's going to help with kernel size. We want to make sure that we have sulfur available throughout the growing season. And it is important that we make sure that we have sulfur in place in the sulfate form for later on when we need that. Guys, that's why when we're side dressing with 28 or 32, we really want to see some 120026 in there with that, or some potassium sulfate in there with it. Please note that it is required in amounts higher than calcium and magnesium. It should be compared to nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium as a major requirement. Plants need sulfur to make protein, to craft chlorophyll, to fabricate enzymes, and fabricate vitamins. We're also seeing some people start to sell vitamins for use in a crop. I'm okay with that, but if we can build them ourselves because we do the right things, let's get to it. Let's do the right thing. Life isn't that hard. We get on the right side of it, figure it out, and then get on the right side of it. Although sulfur occurs in the soil as a sulfate ion, the major source for sulfur is humus. The higher the humus content, the less likely a need for sulfur. Therefore, the humus level and the rate of its increase or destruction is an index to sulfur availability. The bottom line remains the same. The overuse of nitrogen will burn out the humus supply and equally will destroy the sulfur storage system. When we use too much nitrogen, the payments are expensive, and it's not the check we write to the retailer. It's part of it, but the rest of it is in the loss of plant health, in the plugged up stems, in the lack of sulfur, because now we've made it so we can't store as much. And just using more nitrogen means what? Yep, we need more sulfur. On the basis of soil analysis results, it will generally require at least 10 to 20 pounds of sulfur for most soils as a maintenance. Along with nitrogen and boron, sulfur has to be added to the soil on a regular basis. A few numbers that might be of interest to you guys. Grain sorghum. To avoid a deficiency, it takes 34 pounds of sulfur for 180 bushel. Soybeans. 60 bushel of soybeans requires 27 pounds of sulfur. A 75 bushel wheat crop only takes 17 pounds of sulfur. Now, I'm not saying you have to put all of that on. Maybe there's some in your soil. But we've got to make sure that we have enough there to do that. And guys, when we don't have enough sulfur in that wheat, we're going to overuse nitrogen. It's going to fall over, and we're going to hate that. And sulfur helps create what? Yes, protein. It makes amino acids. The amino acids turn into protein. I think that some of us probably should be giving that a real good look as to what we're going to do. Sulfur can help increase the iron availability in soil. Adding lime will always reduce the available iron to that soil. So lime applied has an adverse effect on iron in the plants. Now for us, that's not a problem because we have astronomically high iron levels. And in all the tissue testing we've done, only 1 year did we get some kind of a weather event and we had to foliar feed just like 6 or 8 ounces of iron. The rest of the time, we've been very sufficient. Oftentimes, we're excessive. But for those of you who live up north, or for those of you who are in that high pH soil where you guys fight iron chlorosis, sulfur is your friend because it will help make iron more available. Again, we know that manganese and iron have a unique relationship, and too much of one shoves out the other. We don't get it into the plant. And lastly here out of this book, in addition, low sulfur levels cause less manganese to be available to the crop. At a very high organic matter, 6% or higher, at a very low organic matter, less than 2.5%, both of those will restrict the manganese availability. And sulfur will help make that manganese become more available. Guys, there are a lot of people, as I read, who believe there are actually 4 macronutrients, NPK and sulfur, 2 secondary nutrients, calcium and magnesium. Why? Because that crop needs a lot more sulfur. It needs as much sulfur as it does phosphorus, right? Maybe if we misnamed it, if we'd name it a macro, and then we would apply it like we apply phosphorus, we would have better results. Maybe we'd have healthier soil structure. Maybe we'd have better protein. Maybe we'd have better yield. I think there's a lot of merit in that. And then after the 4 macros, the 2 secondaries, we get into the micros that we're going to get into here in the very near future. Guys, we believe strongly that it's always right to do the right thing. It is never wrong to do the right thing. We believe that very strongly. If you'd like some more information on this, reach out. Text Karen, 641-919-5570. We will be happy to get in touch with you. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you're having a very, very merry holiday season. Hope you have a very Merry Christmas. And as always, we hope you're having a better day.